Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Sherrilyn and I'm so glad you found me. If you're not new here, welcome back. Thank you guys so much for your love and support. It means the world to me. We are going to get right into today's case. There's lots to cover as usual. So if this is your first time, make sure you go and grab some snacks, some wine. We like to sit here, hang out, talk about true crime, sip a little wine. Today I don't have my wine because I'm actually filming in the morning and I'm trying to get this out on Wednesday, filming on a Wednesday. I don't know if it's gonna happen, but it looks like this week is also gonna be like a true crime wine Thursday instead of Wednesday. I apologize. I went camping with the family and I just kind of unplugged for a few days. So I'm gonna do my best to try to get this out on a Wednesday. If you're seeing this on a Thursday, hi. Hope your Wednesday was good. Nonetheless, you're still going to need that wine. You're still going to need those snacks, and let's get into it. First, I want to shout out the greatest hype man and supporter in the world, Valere, who gave me this suggestion to do this case. I've never heard of this woman before. I'm quite surprised because she's quite a piece of work. I mean, I found a lot of these ones are that I don't know. It's like, what? And we are talking about Nanny Doss. She's another older gal, and I'm so surprised how some of these older ones can just be so ruthless. We talked about Dorothea Puentes a few weeks ago and she was something else. But this one, unlike Dorothea targeted her tenants. This one, she targets relatives. Nobody is off limits, not even her grandchildren. If Nanny Doss does not ring a bell to you, you may have heard about this case. She was also referred to as the Giggling Granny, aka Lonely Hearts Killer, aka Black Widow, aka Jolly Black Widow. So Nanny was born, not Nanny, she was actually born Nancy, to a woman named Lou on November 4th, 1905. And Lou had her out of wedlock. In those days, like if you were unwed and a mother, you were shunned, you were damaged goods, you would never find love ever. No one could ever want you. So this was like a really big deal. And for some reason, she didn't want to reveal who the father was. I read that it could have been because she really actually loved this man and he didn't know and she wanted to protect him because he could have been like a soldier who was having an extramarital affair or off serving the country, and she didn't want to like ruin his life. So she never told her family who the father was. I don't think she's ever divulged who the father was because she wouldn't tell her dad who this gentleman was that impregnated his daughter. She was disowned. But she meets a farmer named James Hazel, and a week after Nanny is born, he actually proposes to Lou. So James' story is that he inherited this farm when he was quite young, and there was a lot of debt on the farm. It didn't make a lot of money. He knew there was probably no way that he was going to be able to like financially recover this and was just kind of destined to this like doomed poor lifestyle. And he also found himself undesirable. So he thought, oh, okay, well, I mean, this one doesn't think she's going to find anyone. I'm not going to find anyone. Let's just both settle for each other. This seems to have like worked out more to his benefit because he had people to help him on the farm. It was almost like they were employees. He was a very miserable man, not affectionate, not loving. He was just essentially looking for somebody to marry him and help do all the chores and do all the farm work. Pretty much as soon as Nanny was old enough to contribute to the farm as well, she was out there working long physical hours. It was really taxing and draining. Like these were hours and workloads that, you know, grown people would have to do, and as a child she would have to do it. And the only form of attention she would ever get was usually him asking her why she wasn't working harder or faster, and this should only take this long to do. Why did it take you 10 minutes longer? It's not an efficient use of your time. So she had definitely no sweet tender moments with this guy, but he was the only father she knew. James and Lou also had 4 other children. They had 3 girls and a boy. And he was so strict about needing those extra hands, you know, on the field that they would have to make sure that they planned like each conception according to like when harvest time was, so that his wife wasn't incapable of helping him. A lot of the time, the responsibility to take care of the younger kids fell on Nanny's shoulders, and she wasn't allowed to go to school or go out into the city and do any form of like extracurricular activity or social interaction. She was just required to stay on the farm all the time and either work and help her father, James, or raise the kids. I believe there was a time that her and her brother were allowed to go to school briefly. It was during winter months though, and that was because there was really nothing to do on the farm. Those were slower months, so they were allowed to go then. But it really was pointless because when you're missing so much school, you're so far behind. She was unable to academically catch up to the other students, and she was bullied a lot too because she didn't have the time to form those connections. And then she was also kind of known as like the slower kid because she didn't understand what had transpired throughout the majority of the year. There was only one thing that she really took from school and learned to love, and it was reading. And I think it would be safe to say that she probably loved it so much because it was an escape from the life that she was living. So she liked to read fiction a lot, but primarily her main obsession became Harlequin romance. I don't know if they had Harlequin romance in like the early 1900s, but romance novels that her mom would read. She would read them after her mom was done and just formed such an obsession with these books. When they did go out places, usually it was to visit family. So she would take this book everywhere she'd go. And back then you're in a carriage. And it was actually in a carriage ride one time when they were out to visit family that the carriage got into like an accident. It's not funny. It's just hard for me to like imagine just like, you're on your little carriage and then boom. I don't know why I didn't think like carriages got into accidents, but clearly they get into accidents. And Nanny was sitting directly in front of like a metal bar. And so when they got in their accident, she slammed the bar really hard and hit her head. She was the only one who was severely injured, but this injury affected her for her entire life. She was only 7 years old when this happened, but for the rest of her life, she had severe migraines that would creep up, and they would last for days or even weeks at a time sometimes, where she was just in such excruciating pain that it became normal for her family just to hear like her like blood curdling screams from the pain. The injury also caused her to have violent outbursts and severe mood swings too. She also showed signs of a deep depression, and she probably could have done with a lot of, extensive medical assistance, but her father forbid her mother to take her to the hospital because they needed the hands on the farm. And he said like they really couldn't afford it. And if they took the time off to go and get assessments, then they really couldn't afford things. So she just never got that taken care of or looked at to see if there potentially could have been something to help her in any way. I think before the accident, James was the only father that she knew. So she had love for him because you don't know anything else. You're just like, okay, yeah, my dad's a dick, but I mean, he's my dad. This is all I know. And then it was after the injury when she was seeing how she was being treated and really like his lack of empathy or even care was for her. She at that point realized, okay, like I'm just like a workhorse here. I'm no different than an animal. And had I been an animal, I probably would have been taken out to the back and shot by this point because I'm useless. So she turned to like a little bit of a rebellion and started sticking up for herself at this point. And he was an abusive man. But after she saw him in such a different light, she wasn't scared of him anymore. She basically was just like, I'm in such excruciating pain all the time anyways. Nothing you do to me is going to hurt me further than I am. So like, go for it, bud. Control was such a big part of this guy's like ego, I think though. So even when she was basically like, nothing you can do is going to hurt me, he still tried to control like every other aspect in not only her life, but like all the kids' lives. Right down to like what they could wear, where they could go, who they could see. They could never make themselves look presentable almost because he felt like it was going to attract, like negative attention. If the girls, wore nice outfits, it could catch the attention of predators. I mean, if he was a normal dad, maybe I'd be like, oh, okay, I can sympathize with you, wanting to make sure that your kids are appropriately dressed. But what gets me is that when they would go out and venture out into the city, usually it was to go and visit other family members. And this family just sounds like all sorts of messed up. Like it was a regular occurrence in this family that uncles or cousins would inappropriately touch I'm not even sure if it's just Nanny and her siblings or if it was other family members, but specifically for this story, it was brought up several times that this was something that was like common and known. And it seemed that it had happened to the other siblings and that James got really upset, as one naturally would. But quickly, these relatives would realize that he didn't really give a shit about Nanny, so she was kind of like disposable, and that if they did anything inappropriate to her, he wouldn't do anything about it. So sadly, she just kind of became the kid that they would try to like push the limits with at these like family functions, which is just like, it's like blood boiling to me. And when she would say something to her father, he would try to twist it around and be like, well, what did you do to deserve that? You must have done something. They wouldn't just do this, even though he obviously knew, because they'd already lost his shit when it was his natural children that this had happened to. So, I mean, just more and more trauma laid out there on this girl. So it was clear that anything that had to do with her, his facade of you can't wear this, you can't go here, you can't do this, of protecting her, was just bullshit. And he just needed her on the farm, needed her to help around the house. And when it came to like her as a human, he didn't care. So when she turns 15, she knows that finances are a struggle in the house, and she comes up with an idea to approach him in a way that she can, you know, kind of help and be even more of an asset if he'd let her go out into the world and work, and then she can help contribute to the finances. So at that angle, he was like, yes, for sure. Great idea. You want to give me money? Okay. Like, I can't really argue with that. Really, her motive though is to obviously want to get out of the house. And she's now getting older, especially in those days. I mean, when you were in like your mid-teens, this is kind of when you started to look for and see people as like your potential, you know, forever love. Usually when you got married, it was forever, and you got married really young. So she wanted to go out and meet whoever this love was going to be, and this like big knight in shining armor like she always read in these romance novels. So she gets her first job at like a linen mill, and this is different than school for her. In school, she was really insecure. She was behind. No one liked her because of those circumstances. But in like the workforce, she was more equal to everybody, and she found a confidence and humor, and she had this charisma that she used to her advantage, because she's looking for a husband and she wants that to happen stat, and she wants to get the hell out of her house. So she soon catches the eye of a 17-year-old named Charlie Braggs. He seems to have a good head on his shoulder, and he charmed Nanny's mom. Unlike her father, her mother Lou was the gentle one. She would try to intervene when she saw abuse happen, but oftentimes she would get it just as bad, if not worse, if she said anything. So she tried to be a comfort kind of from the sidelines, and she didn't want her daughter to make the same mistakes or live the same life as her. So this guy appeared to be kind of her daughter's escape and perfect solution to getting her out of the house. He seems to have a good head on his shoulder, especially for his age. He's not going out drinking with like his buddies after work like a lot of young guys were. He took really good care of his mother. So Nanny's parents decide like, yeah, if she's going to be with anybody, he's a good catch. So they give them permission when she's 15 to marry him. I think there was a part of Nanny who was obviously like, first guy who's ready to like lock me down and get me out of here. My parents approved. I'm jumping on board. And I think she thought that any relationship could be like those romance novels, even though the situation like with her family was a horrible example. I think she thought if she could meet the right guy and she knew she could be the perfect wife, there would be no questions that she could have this fairy tale life that she keeps reading about. But pretty much as soon as she got married, she felt like it was more of a transaction, and then realized that her dad probably agreed to it to get her out of his hair because he couldn't handle her rebellion or mood swings anymore. And she's feeling like she kind of made a mistake. And then to add insult to injury, she comes down the stairs the morning after they get married, and she sees her mother-in-law in the kitchen and doesn't really think much of it. She just kind of figures, oh, okay, she's just staying here because, you know, we just got married, I guess, and maybe just wanted to stay the night, and then she's going to go on over to her house later. So she just casually asks her husband, you know, when do you think she's gonna go home? And he's like, she is home. She lives here. You can just tell from that, like, clearly they had no idea what they were getting themselves into, didn't even know each other on a deeper level. I mean, I guess that doesn't even really have to be deep. That's just a simple conversation to be like, my mother lives with me and she will live with us. So this is how she finds out that she's living with her mother-in-law. And this woman, I mean, some people might be okay with living with their mother-in-law, but this woman sounds like you're just, you know, like movie monster-in-law type mother-in-law, where she's like very doting on her son. He's a mama's boy and no one's ever going to be good enough for him. So everything that Nanny does is wrong. If she would do chores a certain way, she'd be behind her, telling her how to correct it, make her redo them. Basically, she left a controlling laborer of a dad to move into a similar situation with a mother-in-law. Charlie didn't see much of this though. He would get offended if Nanny would bring it up, because when he was at home, she would almost turn into this sweet, gentle, soft-spoken, his frail mother. I mean, I guess very similar to the movie Monster-in-Law, if you've seen it. So he's seeing one side and Nanny's seeing another, and he doesn't believe her. Unlike in her home life, when she was trying to escape her reality, she would escape to books, but she wasn't allowed to bring them when she moved into Charlie's house, because he just thought they were like trash and forbid them. So she didn't even have that escape. She ends up drinking to occupy her time and get away from her situation, and starts chain smoking like 40 cigarettes a day. Definitely not the Harlequin romance ending she was hoping for. Despite that though, they stay together for a long time. They have 4 daughters and they're all born a year apart from each other. And even though when she was growing up, she would help care for her siblings a lot, she didn't quite take the same role as a mother. And it didn't bring that, like, them closer together as a family unit. It kind of drew them further away. She just started to look at Charlie as like a baby maker who just wanted to impregnate her. And she wasn't getting any love or affection from him, so she would often leave the kids with her mother-in-law or Charlie, and she would go to their local bar and go drinking and then seek attention from other guys. Charlie was also doing the same behind her back, so it was just kind of like tit for tat, who could cheat on who more. And I think they just stayed together because divorce wasn't very common in those days. And they had 4 kids together, so I don't think like those like arrangements of, okay, you go here for this amount of time and then you come back here over this amount of time was very common. So I think you just stayed together. I don't think Nanny would have cared too much if Charlie had had the kids, except for with her older daughter, whose name was Melvina, and she was like her golden child. So I don't think she wanted to be separated from her. And then it's around here with those conflicts and unhappiness that she starts to spiral completely out of control and just starts like playing scenarios in her head, and they just get darker and darker. She almost, I think when I hear how she's explained, it's almost she's living in her own novel in her head, and she's this, you know, main character who needs this saving, and then when one thing would go wrong, she would just like focus that being the conflict and take it to like extensive drama that would just like build and embellish in her head. And so she's looking at Charlie and she's starting to build this resentment towards him that he probably only wanted to have her around to help care for his mother, help do all of the chores and cook, and provide him with children and nothing more. So then that resentment started to build further into the children. And one day, Charlie arrives home and the house is surrounded by a bunch of people, and he finds out that 2 of his children have died. And when the medical examiner does a report, he concludes that they unfortunately got food poisoning from a bad batch of porridge. And no one questions it. Everybody just thinks this is just a tragic accident. Even Nanny's mother-in-law, who doesn't care for her, never blamed her for, you know, feeding this porridge that she didn't know was going to kill her kids. I don't even think they did an autopsy. I think just based on the scene and Nanny's story, the medical examiner just ruled their death food poisoning, and then she was just instructed to like throw out the grain. Charlie said initially he didn't suspect anything, but then one day he just looked over at Nanny and there was just something about her, like this just dark aura that took over, and he couldn't explain it. It was just like this instant reaction where he looked at her and he just saw darkness in her eyes, and he grabbed their oldest daughter, Nanny's favorite, Melvina, and he just hauled ass out of the house, left Nanny with their other daughter. And he said he would have taken her too, but she was asleep in Nanny's arms at the time and he didn't want to disturb her. So he's like, I'm just going to take my chances, save myself and this one, get out of here. And he left his mother behind as well. So everyone around town just feels terrible for Nanny. You know, she just lost her kids. Now her husband's up and taken one of their children and run away, abandoned his mother. And his mother starts to see Nanny in a different light. I'm assuming he didn't tell her his suspicions because she probably would have wanted to leave as well. So in her mind, I think she was just like, oh, like, why would he do this? You poor thing. Sorry for judging you. Because now she's taking care of this woman who was so nasty to her. And one of her manipulation tactics was that his mother would act frail and very sick, mostly when only he was around or when she was out in public. So people around like town just, you know, saw her as just like this elderly woman who was kind of weak. And so it's been about a year and Charlie has not come back. And Nanny's now working to feed her mother-in-law, feed and take care of herself, and feed and take care of her daughter. And the savings that her and Charlie had are starting to dwindle, and she's not able to keep up with the money that she's making. So her solution is she probably could, you know, survive a little bit longer if it was just herself and her daughter to feed. And, you know, let's eliminate an extra mouth. So as she always does, Nanny would provide the meals, cook for her mother-in-law. And her mother-in-law started getting sicker and sicker and started experiencing severe stomach issues. But she would always tell friends or people around town that Nanny was doing such a great job of taking care of her and trying to nurse her back to health. So she's feeling really thankful and trusting of her. And that was ultimately her biggest mistake because she ends up dying. We can only assume that it was poison probably as well. And for some reason, this doesn't raise any eyebrows. No one stopped to think, okay, the first time, that's like a really tragic incident. No one would ever want to go there and assume that someone would do something to their children. But now, like a year later, the mother-in-law is also gone, who's in Nanny's care. But no one went there. Everybody just further sympathized for Nanny, like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Now the mother-in-law? And you know, her husband of 8 years, he's not even here to help. Like, what a piece of garbage. This poor woman. And Charlie doesn't return right away. It's about a year later, he ends up showing back up to the house, and he's not alone. He's got their daughter Melvina, another woman, and her son. His plan is that he's come back and he wants to drive Nanny out of the house. He has this realization one day that it's ridiculous for him to be out with this woman paying rent somewhere when he has like a perfectly good home that he owns that Nanny is just, you know, occupying and living in. I think he was expecting Nanny to put like up a front and that he would have to try really hard to push her out, which is quite ballsy because he's terrified of her and thinks that she's going to kill him. But he wants this house and he wants to move, you know, his new lady and her son in there and have their life together. But Nanny doesn't press it. She just ends up casually packing up, not saying anything to them, like just ice cold. She grabs both of the girls and she leaves. She ends up going to the family farm, very temporarily picks up exactly where she left off with her dad, assigning, you know, extensive work tasks for her to do. So it doesn't take long for her to venture out and try to find another job. So she finds one in a cotton mill and she makes a lot of money. Plus, she's getting like a lot of dude attention at this place. She's described as like a natural beauty with this charisma and charm. So that's not shocking or unusual. But I think just growing up in her situation, she didn't know how to balance it. It was like anybody and everybody who gave her attention, she just fed into it and had to like reciprocate and talk to everybody and make everybody want to be with her. This time though, she's gonna try to learn from her past marriage mistakes by not jumping into anything too quickly. Even though, you know, there was a sea of opportunities at the mill, she was kind of like Goldilocks. She was, yeah, I know that one. He's too young. I don't want to be stuck living with my mother-in-law again. And a lot of them, they were way too old. They'd been working at these mills their entire life. So, you know, being a fan of all the romance novels, she kind of felt like they couldn't hold their own in the old sackaroo. So she kind of went through all of the options and never found one, unlike Goldilocks, that was just right at the mill. So she moved on to writing ads in the Lonely Hearts column of their paper. I mean, I remember that prior to, you know, internet and stuff. When I was little, there would be those classified ads in the newspaper that would come to the house, and they would be like, seeking, blah, 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 blah. What a time that would have been. It's so easy and accessible right on your phone to just go on a site, swipe left or right, and boom, bang, bing, you're done. To actually think about writing out an ad, submitting it to the paper, waiting to get it published on that week, then seeing if anybody's going to reply back to you. It's kind of like a really cool concept, and like the anticipation to build would probably have been so much more exciting back in the day. But anyways, so she starts writing and submitting these ads. Like at the cotton mill, she would feed into absolutely everybody who wrote her back. She would correspond back and forth with every single letter. And then not only that, but, you know, since she wanted everybody to love her, she would also bake them goodies because she was a fabulous cook when she wasn't killing people with her cooking. And so she would send baked goods too, so that just even further wrangled these suitors in for her. So after about a year of corresponding with tons of gentlemen, she feels like she's taking her time, doing the right thing, and she gets a letter from a gentleman named Robert Franklin Harrelson. He went by Frank though, and he was 22 years old, so he was 2 years younger than Nanny. Apparently this guy looked like a movie star, caught her attention right away. She was like, yep, I've been holding off. Thank God I have. This is the one for me. So she writes him. I think it actually initially he was the one who like posted his ad and she saw it. So she was the one to like reach out and write him. And she sent a photo of herself as well as a piece of cake. And he was so impressed and intrigued by her that she did this that he didn't even write her back. He just took the address from the letter that she had sent and showed up right at her house. Obviously, she's like, oh my God, how romantic. He just opened the door and he's here. This is meant to be. This is the guy that I've been waiting for. He courts her for about 2 months, showering her with gifts, flowers, surprise visits. And it only takes those 2 months for him to decide that he wants to spend his life with her as well. So he proposes and then they get married not long after that. I guess with this marriage, the town supported it because they still viewed Nanny as this sweet woman who did everything to try to make her marriage work, lost her children, lost her mother-in-law, lost her husband to another woman. So they were rooting for her and they were really excited that she seemed to find this perfect guy. But her parents, they weren't supportive of this marriage, so they didn't show up to the wedding. I guess Frank never asked for permission from them to get married, so they were insulted. And then he was also wanting to move across the country to Cedartown, and they didn't want to lose their grandchildren because Nanny had been living with them while this courtship was happening after leaving Charlie. And the girls had gotten really close to the grandparents and they spent most of their time with them because Nanny was working. So they felt like they were losing 2 of their own children. So they didn't have any support from them and they didn't go to the wedding. But she's unfazed by this though. They pack up, they move across the country with the girls, and everything I think starts out like the fairy tale that she was expecting. Frank seemed to be quite doting. He gave her lots of compliments, provided well for her. He didn't have the greatest paying job, but the opportunity that he moved to across the country for was one that he told her that he had potential to like grow for, and they were stable. It wasn't like busting their ass like on the farm and not getting anywhere. So like in her mind, anything was better than that. Nanny said the only fault that she could see in her husband Frank was that he was a drinker. He drank often, liked his whiskey, and liked it a lot. So for her, that was a trigger because it just took her back to her last marriage where she was the one who was drinking often and she was doing it to escape her marriage and her unhappiness. So in her mind, she was like, okay, well, I was drinking because I was so unhappy. you must be drinking because you're so unhappy. And she would take it personally and think that she was doing something wrong. So she would bring this up to him and he would just explain to her like, no, there's no underlying message here. I'm just a guy who likes to socialize with my friends after work. Go and have some drinks. It's not because of anything you're doing. So she's trying to be like the docile, supportive wife, and she doesn't really question it, but his drinking starts to intensify and he's staying out for longer periods of time. She tried a couple different tactics. She tried cutting him off completely and it worked temporarily, and then it just caught up with him and he went off the rails because he was like, oh, I gotta catch up with all of these months missed of going out with the boys. So he even got like further into drinking at that point. Then she figured, okay, well, you know, if you can't beat him, you can join him. So she started going out and drinking like toe to toe with him. And then together they would be out all night, sometimes even longer. And one time actually they had dropped off Melvina at some friends' houses, but they forgot about Nanny's younger daughter, Florine, and they just left and went drinking. They were gone for a couple days, and it takes about 2 days, and I'm not sure who tipped the police off, but the police go to their home, get Florine, and they bring her all the way back to Charlie's. Obviously, you know, when she comes back from this episode, she realizes she's gone, finds out that she's at Charlie's, and she goes and just scoops her back up. I'm not sure why Charlie never like fought to, you know, not let her take her, lock the doors or whatever reason, but she takes her back. And it sounds like it had really nothing to do with her even missing her or wanting her baby back. It was more that even though the older daughter was her favorite, she said she didn't want to give Charlie the satisfaction of raising his daughter and having that happiness and that joy around him all the time. So this was a game, and she was using her daughter as a pawn. So she's slowed down, but Frank isn't, and he sounds like he's going further and further out of control. His drinking is getting so excessive that he's missed out on those promotions and opportunities in work over the years because he's looked at as like the town drunk, and he starts to take it out on his family. He becomes verbally and physically abusive to Nanny and the girls. Even though Nanny knew what that was like to grow up with an abusive father, she didn't leave the situation. She stayed with Frank. So the girls, they were taken away from their father because he lived so far away. They never saw him. So now Frank, similar to Nanny, is the only father role for them, and he's repeating history. And then so did the girls, because like Nanny, they're like, okay, we need to get the hell out of here as soon as we can. So very early on, they start going out to look for their husbands to whisk them away from this life. So in 1942, her oldest and favorite, Melvina, meets a gentleman named Mosey, and they get married. A year after they get married, they have a baby, and his name is Robert. And it sounds like Nanny is really hands-on, very involved with being a grandparent, but in the back of her mind, she is always projecting still. She starts playing out these scenarios in her head and applying them to Melvina's life, even if they probably aren't accurate. She was almost like trying to control every single situation in that marriage and in taking care of the baby so that she could try to like shape the future to be different than how hers turned out to be. And then when Melvina gets pregnant again, not long after having Robert, Nanny starts being like, oh, okay, this is now out of control. This is exactly how I ended up. He's trying to turn her into a baby making machine, just like Charlie tried to do to me. He's gonna leave her. She's gonna be alone with these babies. Like, I can't let this happen. So when it's time for Melvina to have her baby, she's experiencing complications. It sounded like a really difficult labor, and she kept asking for her mother to come to the room with her. So Nanny comes in and takes over. She kicks Melvina's husband out of the room. I believe it was obviously the delivery nurse and doctor, Melvina, Nanny, and Florine. So she steps in and takes over like the husband coaching, like birthing coaching role, getting her through the breathing, getting her through this horrendous labor, and it's exhausting. It's taken everything out of like everybody in the room. When the baby's finally born, Melvina's just so wiped out and drained and just delirious from like pain and exhaustion that she can't even hold her newborn. So the doctor just passes the baby off to Nanny. They leave them to have, you know, their first moments with the baby, and they come back several minutes later, and Nanny's holding the baby, and she's just glossy-eyed, in a daze, shocked, with like grief on her face, and they notice that the baby is dead. They come to the conclusion that the baby was deprived of oxygen, probably because of the trauma that had happened during the delivery and birth, and it could have just been something that they didn't catch. Naturally, when Melvina starts to like grasp reality and is realizing that this is actually happening and it isn't some nightmare that she's concocting in this like haze that she's in, she's obviously devastated and distraught. But when they get home, she's having a hard time deciphering reality from exhaustion, I think. And I mean, I think if you are a mother, you can probably relate. It kicks the shit out of you and you're so tired. And there are so many times where you're just, what freaking day is this? Is this a dream? How many days have I gone with a minute of sleep? I can't even imagine back in those days where you didn't have the extra hands-on help or tools to, you know, like cope and get through it. So she's having a really hard time dealing with the loss of her baby, trying to recover from this physically, emotionally draining delivery, and she's not sure what's exhaustion or reality. So she confides in her sister Florine, and she says that she has this flashback of this nightmare that she can't shake, and it's of seeing their mother pull a hat pin out of her hat and stick it into the baby's soft spot in her head. Florine can't believe it. She just goes numb because as she's listening to her sister say this, she remembers coming back into the room after leaving to go tell Mosey that he has a baby. And when she returned, Nanny is just sitting there in her like daze, and she's just rolling a hat pin in between her fingers, looking off into the distance. Obviously, at that moment, Florine wouldn't have ever thought anything. Why would she associate that in any reality? But now she's like, oh my God, Kay, are you right? Or now are we both like, you know, making these horrendous accusations? So they decide they can't come to terms with that. They cannot even go there. Their mother would never do something like that. And they just push it off to the side. With this tragedy, it caused a rift in Melvina and Mosey's marriage. And it caused them both to seek attention elsewhere. So Melvina started carrying on an extramarital affair with a soldier. And Nanny catches wind of this and loses her shit because, again, she projects and she's trying to rework the crystal ball and redo all of the mistakes that she's made in her life and make sure that her daughter doesn't make the same mistakes. But she's making all of the same mistakes that Nanny did. The angrier she gets, like the more it starts to stew and bubble and brew into something catastrophic. So now she's like, you know, how ungrateful is she? I've tried so hard. She's been my golden child. I do this because I love her. She doesn't even respect me enough to take my advice and try to live a better life than I did. Melvina's not budging. She feels, you know, well, like her husband's already off doing the same thing. Why can't she? She doesn't want to be the sucker who's staying at home while she knows her husband's off with another woman. She's going to do the same thing. So oftentimes she would leave for sometimes a week at a time, sometimes just on the weekend. And it was Nanny who would be the one to take care of and watch her grandson, Robert. So during one of these drop-offs, Nanny's had it, and her and Melvina get into a big blow up, essentially over Nanny feeling like she's done everything for her and she's not learning from her mistakes. But Melvina claps back with, mind your own business. If it wasn't for you putting me in this predicament in the first place and basically, you know, giving me no chance but to run away from the house that I was living in with the man that you married, we wouldn't be here. So she leaves the house and she goes and meets her lover. And then, like Nanny always does, she just sits there and starts replaying the situation and the conversation over and over and getting angrier and angrier, and then she snaps. Her grandson Robert is playing, and Nanny just looks at him like the tool she's going to use to hurt her daughter, who's clearly not listening or respecting her. She reaches for a box of rat poison. When I first read this, I was like, okay, like, as one does. But back in the day, that was really common to have rat poison in your house. I mean, now if I saw somebody with rat poison in their garage, I'm sure it's still like a common thing to have, especially maybe like on farms. But I would be like, Dateline radar, Dateline radar. So she grabs a box of rat poison and she makes him some cookies. I mean, obviously we know where this is going. And she saw this as a lesson to teach her daughter not to disobey her. In the morning, she wakes up and poor Robert, he's obviously gone. She, springs into Meryl Streep actress mode and calls the police all distraught. She's trying to get a hold of her daughter. When the doctors arrive, she's inconsolable. So no one's brain goes to this being something monstrous. They end up ruling his death as caught death. I'm not sure why, but for some reason, after this specific incident, her daughters still wouldn't go to that place where she had anything to do with the baby or with Robert's death, and nothing was investigated for Robert. I mean, I think it's safe to say they obviously had this so suppressed. It was lurking and lingering, but maybe to say it out loud, they just couldn't bring themselves to do. They weren't alone in their suspicions. I believe it was at Robert's funeral that Frank went up to the girls, and in the middle of their conversation, he just said, "I'm next," which turned out to be an accurate premonition because not long after he was. In his case, he never ate at home though. He was always out drinking, so Nanny couldn't poison his food like she preferred to do. And she also is getting the feeling like, okay, this has to be, planned out. I can't just do this on impulse because now there's all of these deaths that are starting to surround me and people are going to get suspicious. So this needs to, have no tie or connection to me. So while she's patiently waiting for this opportunity, she's in her garden one day and she finds a hidden bottle of moonshine. So Frank had been not only, going out and drinking, he would come home and, sneak into the backyard and top himself up. So she's like, bingo, this is my opportunity. She goes and grabs her rat poison, dumps it into the bottle, and then reburies it. I think it was actually that night that he went and found it. In the morning, Nanny finds him in the yard. He looks like he's passed out. He's got the bottle of moonshine still in his hand. So she calls the police and says that she's found her husband in the yard. He killed himself by drinking too much. So when the police arrive, it's the perfect situation for her. He's out in the yard. He's got the bottle of moonshine. The thing is completely empty. So they just chalk this up as another tragedy that's happened in our life. When Nanny's daughters find out about this, even though they didn't have the greatest relationship with their stepfather, they couldn't ignore the fact that there were just way too many coincidences at this point, and they were finally able to acknowledge that their mother had not only killed him, but her 2 grandchildren and her mother-in-law and 2 of their siblings. So when Frank died, this was the first time that Nanny got a payout from a death. So she was pumped about that because now she could invest her money and didn't have to rely on anybody to take care of her. So she ended up investing in land and a property and lived independently for the first time in her life. After a while, it got old for her though. She went back to where it all began at the Lonely Hearts ads, and she finds a gentleman named Arlie Lanning. He was successful. He didn't have any kids or baggage, so she was really excited on that. And he lived quite a ways away. So she boarded a train and headed on over to Lexington to meet him. And then again, like the other men that she met online in the paper, he was equally as impressed with her. He was drawn into her charisma and her charm right away. So they headed off in their first visit. His friends and family really liked her and they all gave her the, stamp of approval. So basically she just takes the train back home to pack up her things and then she moves back on out and they get married. With Arlie, he was kind of a mixture of Charlie, who was having extramarital affairs, and Frank, who liked to drink. So he was doing both behind Nanny's back. This time, instead of trying to change him and seeking this perfect relationship that I think she was slowly realizing, was not attainable, she started having affairs of her own. And they do this for like 5 years, this back and forth, cheating on each other. Then they try to like reconcile and go through like the honeymoon phase again. And then one day, she just got sick of it. She was tired of feeling like an adulterer. But instead of just leaving, she bakes him one of his favorite pies. And I mean, you know what happens next. So the medical examiner in this case rules his death as heart failure. So she, again, has dodged another bullet. I mean, I don't understand like how many deaths around one person is just like not coincidence anymore. Complete opposite of anybody having suspicion. They all rally around her. Arlie's family took her in and wanted to make sure that she was going to be okay. And with Arlie, he hadn't updated his will. So I think Nanny had gotten a little taste of what inheriting some money could feel like. And I think she was expecting that with him. But his will had left his house to his sister. And it sounds like this sister kind of had like, some like ups and downs and some like mishaps along the way in life. So she didn't really have all like the success and fortune in the world. So she was like, oh, I'm not gonna freaking turn that down. Hell no. And I think Nanny expected her to be like, okay, you know what? Yeah, this wasn't updated. It's your property. You guys were married. You lived there. I'll just sit this one out. But yeah, she wasn't like that. She was like, well, he said so, and who am I to say no? So she stays in the house. And then not long after that, the house goes up in flames. Shocking. And conveniently, Nanny's things had all just been moved out. So nothing was damaged of hers. And then even though originally Arlie's mother had supported Nanny and brought her into her home, she was like, oh, okay, well, now this is a little bit suspicious. You don't get the property, and now all of a sudden your stuff gets moved out and the house catches on fire. And she sounds like the woman who was the town gossip leader. So, like, if she thought something, all of her little elderly lady friends would be like, oh, yeah. So if suspicion started brewing more, Nanny couldn't have that because she couldn't have people investigating this fire. And what do you know it? Her mother-in-law starts getting sick. And it sounds like she had gotten a really awful flu earlier, and this one had taken out a lot of members of like their community. So everyone just assumed that it was coming back and she was fighting it off again. And then again, everybody was just so impressed that her daughter-in-law, Nanny, was there to dote on her hand and foot and take care of her and try to nurse her back to health. And she'd tell her friends that Nanny was making her these stewed prunes to make her feel better. But unfortunately, she meets the same fate as everybody else that Nanny cares for. So now she's feeling like with that mother-in-law out of the way and she can't, spread any suspicion, she's good and clear to go back home to the investment property that she had purchased when Frank died. So when she gets back home, she hears that her sister's not doing well. What do you know? Nurse Nanny to the rescue. She goes and tries to nurse her back to health. And it's like, why would anybody call her at this point anymore? Why would you ever notify her specifically if someone was not doing well? Because her track record of like nursing people back to health is 0 for like 5 at this point. Or, oh my God, like more than that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She's at like 8. If I had to sneeze at this point near this woman, I would be like... So she's there for a week and the sister's showing no signs of improvement. We obviously know that. So for this though, it sounds almost like Nanny... I don't know if she actually did try to nurse her sister back to health. And then she figured like it had been a week or so. She wasn't doing well. And I think she was just kind of over it. She's like, oh, well, you know what? You're kind of unhelpable at this point. I've got things to do. So I'm just going to, further push along the inevitable here. And so she starts cooking up her favorite stewed prunes mixture. And then her sister is the next to go. So when they're at the funeral, Nanny finds out that her father had died. and no one had told her that James had passed away. I couldn't find out like specifically why that was the case, but she finds out at the funeral. And then there was like this anger in her because I think she felt, you know, she's on this revenge spree now, and a lot of the deep-seated anger and hate came from her childhood and him. And I think she felt like she wanted to serve some justice. So the darkness just started to form even more because she felt like she was like ripped away that opportunity to like take him out. So she reaches out to her mom, who inherited the farm and all the debt, and she's facing homelessness. So Nanny knows she's in a situation where she needs to be taken care of. And, you know, as she cares and cooks for her mom, coincidentally, her mom starts getting sick. And the more she cares, the sicker she gets until she dies. Again, you'd kind of figure that people might start to, at this point, maybe get a little bit suspicious. But no, everybody around town is like, oh my gosh, you know, you poor thing, how are you still alive and coping? How can you handle all of this death and devastation in your life? And again, no one's also noticing the pattern that not long after this, she goes back to her ads and seeks out another companion. This time she moves on to a different column though. I think this was, I mean, I'm not 100% sure. I believe it was a subscription, almost like kind of like an eHarmony would probably be. So like if you were serious about it, you would pay, and like your chances of finding, you know, something a little bit more concrete was higher in this one. And this one was called the Diamond Circle Club, and I believe it was like a $15 fee. So Nanny shifts over to that option this time. And even though this was like the more mature version of the Lonely Hearts ads, she finds a gentleman named Richard Morton, and Richard is not, you know, old and decrepit. He's really good looking man, takes good care of himself. He's, you know, tall, dark, and handsome. And Nanny was really impressed. And he was really impressed with Nanny too. So much so that on that first visit, he proposes to her and then they get married not long after. Again, like all of the other husbands, she thinks this is the one, the Harlequin romance. They're gonna write a book about their love story one day. They live in an idyllic little home. He showers her with love and attention and lots of gifts. And she starts to learn that gifts are like his love language. So she's not complaining. And for the most part, he likes to be at home. In the beginning of their marriage, during that honeymoon phase, he was home a lot more, and she got used to that and comfortable with it. And then slowly, as he would venture out into town for supplies, those visits turned out to be like longer and longer. And Nanny finds out that he's also showering other young women in town with the same exact gifts as he's bringing home to her. So this time, I mean, she's pretty much like a veteran at this point. She's just like emotionless about the whole thing. I don't think she confronts him at all. She just kind of lets him carry on the way he's doing it. And behind the scenes, she's already starting to look for another option in the Diamond Club. And she's also applying for as many life insurance policies as she can on him. So quite quickly, I believe only 3 months they were married, Richard comes home to find his wife's made him a beautiful apple pie, and he doesn't wake up after eating it. With this death, again, no one questions anything. I guess it is fair to say that she did start to like move around the country at this point, so this was not all happening in the same town. So for us hearing it, we're like, come on, man. But this wasn't all just happening in the same spot. So no one questions or suspects anything. He was older, so the medical examiner just assumed that it was old age, and Nanny didn't ask for an autopsy, obviously. So that was it. She was able to cash out and leave without suspicion. And then, you know, maybe you hope that she just has this satisfaction where she's like, okay, you know, I'm really just such a shitbag of a person. Maybe there's a chance of redemption for me if I can just stop taking out people that I'm married to and related to. But no, she finds a gentleman named Samuel Doss. He was a highway inspector, and then on Sundays, he was also the preacher for their church. He was very by the book, like no smoking, no drinking, no gambling. He didn't even swear. And it's not even a month since she buried her last husband that she marry Samuel. Maybe there was a point of her that was hoping that there could be a chance for this to work out. He was so much different than her other husbands in the sense of not drinking and her knowing that he wouldn't have any affairs behind her back. But it's with Samuel where you just realize she just liked to kill, and she just tried to look for and find excuses in every situation that would justify her doing that. And with him, since, you know, she didn't have the poor me narrative to play out with like the affairs and drinking, she started focusing on like his frugality. She felt like she was so controlled because he didn't like if the fan was on. It had to be unbearably hot. And she felt like, you know, it was inhumane to make somebody wait until the point of them almost passing out from heat to use a fan. I mean, we don't know if that's actually true, but this is the narrative that she came up with in her head. And she said that the lights couldn't be on for a very long time. I grew up like that. I didn't think about serving my family a rat poison pie. And then she also felt control in the sense of his structure. He was a very by the book kind of guy, so everything had like a time and a plan. Even dinners and bedtime and like boom boom time, that was all written down in the calendar and scheduled with a time. Meet you there. This is what we're eating. This is when we're fornicating. And we need to stick to the schedule. I felt sad reading about Samuel because he just seemed like a nice guy, just like very rigid, kind of like boring for her. But he was a good man. And there was an opportunity for him to just, you know, be done with her and let bygones be bygones because she had left. But he ended up wanting her to come back and he missed her, so he sent her a letter. In the letter, it wasn't like, please, I miss you, I've made so many mistakes, I'm going to change my ways. It was basically just like an outline of the reasons why he felt like she should come back and be with him. Because I mean, like, that's just like what his personality was. He wasn't like gushy and mushy and excited. He was just very square and structured and by the book. So Nanny gets this letter, and in her dark twisting of every situation, she just comes to the realization that this is her opportunity to get back at her father, because what Samuel's trying to do right now is exactly what her father used to do by trying to control and manipulate every situation. So she sees this as the opportunity to get revenge by doing that through Samuel. So she agrees to come back, but she tells him the only condition that she wants to come back on is if he adds her to his bank accounts, and she says it's to prove that he's going to try to like loosen up on the control of finances and not being like as frugal as he was. So he agrees. And as soon as he does that, he starts to get sick. He wasn't much of a pastry guy or a pie guy, so Nanny would mix poison in his nightly coffee, and he didn't die right away, like I'm sure she hoped. So he has the chance to go to his doctor, and they admit him into the hospital to try to figure out what's causing all these stomach issues, and he's there for like 28 days, I think. They end up getting him nursed back to health, but they still don't have an answer as to what could be causing it. But they feel, you know, he's well enough to go back home. And his first night home, Nanny prepares a pork roast with stuffing and potatoes, gives him his nightly coffee. She tucks him into bed, and then next thing we know it, the ambulance is right back there in the morning, and he's gone. But this situation was different. Since he had been closely monitored by his doctor and everybody was trying to find out what could have caused this and how they could fix it, I think in their mind initially they were planning for like some sort of illness that was going to sweep and take out more people. So they wanted to understand, you know, maybe how they could prepare and fight that. So the doctor asks Nanny if she can give permission to do an autopsy so they can study and try to be proactive if this is like a flu or something that's going to start coming around. So she's got no other choice but to agree, because at this point, if she says no, they're gonna be suspicious, because it's like, if you have nothing to hide, why would you say no? So she agrees, and she's just hoping there's gonna be some way that she can explain herself out of this if they find any poison in his system. And they did. They found a lot of poison in his system. I think it was like enough cyanide to kill a horse. So it couldn't be like, oh, a little speck, you know, maybe it could be poison. It was a substantial amount. So right away, they notify the police and they take Nanny in for questioning. She's denying it all, but part of what's given her like this notoriety and some of her nicknames is she has this habit of just bursting out into like laughter and giggles while she was talking about these serious, situations and accusations. So she would just burst out laughing, denying it, but going into like these fits of uncontrollable laughter. So I think they were going on like an entire day of questioning and she's just not budging. And the police officers are like, you can't get out of this, man. Like, this is so blatantly obvious. You're the only one with the opportunity. He didn't do this to himself. You're basically stuck. So in order to try and sway and entice her to agree, they tell her that they'll take the death penalty option away if she admits to what she did. Apparently, she just sat there for a couple minutes, not saying anything, and then just was like, okay, I put rat poison in his coffee. That was it. There was like no probing, no more questioning or going back and forth. It was like, okay, yeah, I'll take it. So on May 17th, 1955, she pleads guilty to killing 4 husbands, and that's all that she ever would admit to. She didn't admit to any of her relatives' death, even though, I mean, she's not fooling anybody, but it would have probably been nice just to have that 100% clarity that she did it. But she never did. She spent 10 years in prison and then she died of leukemia. And up until she died on June 2nd, 1965, she was still exchanging letters with suitors while she was in jail. I mean, I feel like it's safe to say that was like, there would have never been stopping this woman. She had to get caught. It's just so unfortunate that it took like that long to catch her or to figure it out. I guess like, she wasn't really on the run. I mean, she was just blatantly advertising right in the newspapers. But oh my gosh, what a freaking whirlwind that one was. It's these stories that it's almost like you do detach a little bit because you're just like, come on, man. It doesn't even almost feel real each time she does it again. You're just like, no. But she did. And she got away with it for so long. How, as a grandmother, do that to your grandchildren? That's the parts that you want to, you do want to disassociate with and be like, there's no way people can do this. And even at the end, I just kind of felt like it was just such an easy out for her. 10 years in jail. Yes, leukemia is just horrendous to go through, but it's like you were only in jail for 10 years and you wiped out like your entire family. That's just how I felt about it. Naturally, in these cases, you want answers as to like what makes people snap. And she never provided anything, but I think some people feel like that brain injury that she had at a very young age just affected something in her that controlled any form of like empathy or decision making. I'm not 100% convinced. I mean, I know that there are people who are just out there and that they're pure evil. Yeah, that might have had like a contributing factor, but it was like the everyday like coldness. It wasn't just one situation. It was just so many. She was a serial killer and didn't even blink an eye or seem to have any pause where she was like, okay, this brain injury is really, really taking its toll on me. I really need some help. And again, like, I don't know. I guess when you deal with those injuries, you're not like, maybe it's the brain injury. I don't even know where to think on that one. I don't even understand where any sense could be made out of this one. But you guys let me know. You let me know what you think. I want to hear from you, always. That is it for me today. And I'm sorry if I, keep providing content that makes you question elderly people. Because like I've said in the DOROTHEA PUENTES video, it really hurts my heart because I love them ever so. And this is like the last thing that you would want to think about a grandmother just like taking out their children. So, I mean, do the best you can to like not question your own grandparents and still just love them with all their heart because there are so many who don't do things like this. But these ones just keep falling in my lap. I'm sorry. All right, you guys, I will see you on Saturday. I will miss you until then. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means the world to me. I love and I appreciate you so freaking much. Stay safe, love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye.